Hi everybody, Teddy Baldassarre here. Now, as watch enthusiasts, I think many times the idea of movement, servicing is kind of something that we almost avoid or just don't talk about. We just think about the purchase and not really what it takes to maintain a watch. But today we're gonna actually be talking to a watchmaker here inside Borsheims. His name's Carson. He's certified to service on Omegas, different Swatch Group brands, as well as select Richemont brands, and just kind of talking through with him, getting some ideas, debunking the myths, talking through what you should be considering in terms of servicing your watch over some time. Now, before we head inside, there's a new portion of our site called Authorized Pre-Owned. So we work directly with the brands to get actually nearly new products that are not able to be sold as new and selling to you at a discount. So definitely check it out. We have some great brands, new offerings there. Link will be in the description, but let's head inside, talk to Carson. All right, guys, now here with Carson, very nice to meet you. And
nice to meet you.
So I feel like you'll agree with this, but we're gonna probably talk about some, I'd say, hot button issues and just best practices for just watches, movements, servicing, and I think probably with watchmakers, it is opinion at the end of the day.
It is,
watchmaker.
yes.
I mean, there's no end all be all, what is the best thing to do always, but I think the watchmaking perspective sometimes is somewhat missed from enthusiasts. They don't think about long-term, what is the cost for ownership or things that I should consider, as they're kind of going about. But I guess one of the first things that I always hear people talk about, and it's kind of very much a marketing jargon kind of term, but in-house versus just more of an off-the-shelf third party like an ETA or Sellita.
Right.
There's, of course, I think we understand the difference between in-house, where it's constructed, but and the complexity and about the process of constructing them. But in terms of for you as a watchmaker, when you are sitting down with an in-house caliber or something of that sort, and the training that's involved to learn that versus the upside of just getting an off-the-shelf movement, could you kind of talk about that dynamic of difficulty with looking at an in-house versus say an off-the-shelf type of movement?
So there's definitely benefits to both. One of the big benefits with ETA is that it's tried and true. 7750, 2824, 2892. Those a lot of people don't really realize or think about, those have been out there for 30, 40 years in watches with very minimal changes. So they're just kind of proven, they're reliable, parts are readily available, and they're workhorses. Whereas in-house, newly developed in-house, they kind of sometimes work out the kinks. There are a lot of brands, as we know, that when they first release an in-house movement, there are going to be issues, just like anything. But the benefit is you get maybe a longer power reserve. You can change the dial configuration a little bit bigger to fit in bigger watches, a little bit better finishing. So, and then of course you can kind of introduce newer technologies like, silicon and so on and so forth, ceramic ball bearings.
From a servicing perspective though, say you get time-wise, time investment, what do you think for a difference in just so people can appreciate kind of what goes into both ends and the upside of both? Because I think a lot of people in-house, and then it's just in-house, and they don't think about it any further than that. And I think there are probably both sides that are kind of considered. So from when you're going deconstructing, disassembling, and going throughout the entire process, is there a huge time difference typically between the two and
in terms of servicing one versus another? Not necessarily. I mean, when you boil it down, all movements are virtually constructed the same way. There are different iterations. There are some things that are a little different on one brand to another. But in general, the escapement set up the same, the train bridge is set up the same. A lot of things are very similar. So not necessarily unless you get to a really complicated watch. I would say in general, in terms of servicing, time-wise, it's pretty much the same. It really varies more on complication, I would say.
What about modular systems, so a Dubois de Praz and things like that? Is there any point of consideration there for somebody that's looking at those rather than say a traditional Valjoux 7750? From a watchmaker's perspective, is something they should think about? Yeah,
definitely. So not all watchmakers service those is one thing. Serviceability on, especially in-house, but even Dubois de Praz, a lot of people don't service the modules. Some people will service.
They just replace it straight
They'll
out?
just, if they can. Because that's another thing. Parts availability is kind of a different thing. It's a hot topic too. That is definitely something to be factored in terms of serviceability. It's going to be a little bit more expensive if you have to do that versus a 7750 that most watchmakers can do with their eyes closed. It's a pretty basic movement and works
So there's
great.
there's huge upside if maybe spending a little bit more, because it's sometimes where brands use like an actual modular system
Right.
to cut down the price, which can be
Right.
really appealing when buying it. But sometimes there's also like the big picture of maybe cost per ownership.
Right.
That difference is going to be paid out in, say, the next service.
Exactly.
So-
And again, the benefit to a Dubois de Praz is you can configure it a little bit differently. So
Yeah, flexibility.
general 7750, you have 369 or 1296, whatever, different registers, and really not much variance, not much other complications on that. So the benefit to a Dubois de Praz is that you can add maybe GMT or power reserve or all these other things, but ultimately it's gonna be a little bit more difficult to find parts for that. So,
Got it. One of the top questions I was asked when I was mentioning, hey, I'm going to talk to a watchmaker, talking about watch winders. Like this is like for some reason, and I hear a lot of different things. From my logical perspective, I think that they're probably maybe they're unnecessary in my mind, and I think they do probably just cause unnecessary friction. I mean, the escapement is, it's moving along. Like it is causing friction to just go. But then people say, hey, lubrication, it helps keep things from drying up.
Yeah.
How much of that is BS? What is just your take on it? I know there's no
say-
end all be all, but it's
I'd
good to
say
get a
about-
watchmaker's perspective.
About 50-50 BS.
Okay, 50-50.
Honestly, you kind of have to be careful about what winder you use, because it can overwind it. And if you think of an automatic watch, it's got that slipping bridle to kind of help it not overwind.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if it's on a winder, it will rub the inner walls of the barrel and it can wear it down. So personally, I don't use them. I can see situationally if you have maybe a perpetual calendar. Generally, I recommend kind of a once a month thing to let your watch run, which most people do in general, unless it's a pocket watch that you really never use.
Yep.
But that's usually what I recommend. Just wind it up and then let it run down at least once a month.
Another thing too is for storing watches and just best practices to mitigate risk. Is there any other things to consider, like where to store them, or anything else that comes to mind from a watchmaker's perspective that maybe somebody just overlooks?
Other than the obvious things of not, trying to store it at low humidity, not extreme temperatures. In general, obviously service your watch regularly and really stay on top of water resistance testing too. Any kind of variance in humidity. A lot of people think, I don't need to test it because I'm not going to swim with it. But it's more than that, especially here in the Midwest or other parts of the East Coast. There's a lot of humidity in the summer, and that can kind of introduce itself into your watch, and it's important to check up on that at least, I would say, once a year, maybe twice a year.
So you mentioned 1 year to retest, and that's if you're pushing the thing to the limit. So say I have a watch with 300 meters of water resistance, how slowly does that water resistance almost deteriorate? Is it still good for 100 meters of water resistance over time? Is there any linear path that you see with the deterioration, or is it so open to?
It's difficult to say. It's very subjective. Again, how often do you have it outside? Salt water, these kind of things, heat, temperature, that changes it. I've had watches come in here on the flip side that haven't been serviced in 15 years and still pass a pressure test. So it's very subjective, but unless that's kind of the most important thing is to know at least, and to regularly test it. That way, if you do get pushed in the pool or something, then your watch is going to be fine. So generally it's a quick test to do at maybe 5-10 minutes. Some watchmakers don't charge for it, some that do. It's pretty minimal in the long scheme.
Regular service interval, do you have a typical range that you recommend to people? Are you kind of you have a lot of anecdotal evidence too. You see things coming in hey, this guy waited too long, this person came in at the right time. Is there typically a good window for people to look out for? Is it best to look for the mistake or an issue, or are you proactive about it? What do you think?
Be proactive for sure.
Okay.
Because again, water resistance, if you wait and don't service it, water gets inside. You're talking about replacing the hands, the dial. That can get very costly, very expensive. And of course, if there's a patina to it, you're not going to replace that. So definitely water resistance testing as much as you can. Like I said, we like to say general rule of thumb is 5 to 7 years. Some you can, especially more modern brands with modern technology, modern lubricants, can push it to 10 years. So we kind of give the 5 to 10 years range, depending on what you're doing, how often you're wearing it, so on and so forth.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I know you also have a workshop in the back. What might be helpful as well, just to kind of close us off, is could you go through some of the tools you use on a day-to-day basis as a watchmaker that perhaps some people watching have just never seen before, just know what goes into actually servicing a watch, testing the gaskets, everything of that sort? Could we take a look?
Absolutely, let's go.
Let's head back. Okay, Carson, so we're back here at your workstation, and I know we've probably already gotten a little too nerdy, let's be real, but I'd love to just kind of go through, like, what are some things that are at arm's length on your desk when you're working on a watch, for people that are maybe watching and just not familiar, and maybe we can go through the back and see some other tools as well.
Yeah, for sure. So first and foremost, most important thing is screwdrivers. This obviously has a lot of different sizes, from 0.6 millimeter all the way up to 2.5 millimeter. And something that's interesting that a lot of watchmakers are moving to now is these torque collars. And basically it's a little collar that goes on and slides on, and it prevents you from over torquing or under torquing a screw. And you can kind of hear it clicking. So the idea is when you're tightening down, this specific collar is for case back screws and bracelet screws. So the idea is that when you're tightening it down, it doesn't damage them by over tightening it. And same with when you're loosening it. So that's something that a lot of the brands are doing to kind of prevent damage to screws when you're sizing, even movement screws, so you're not cranking them down and maybe breaking the heads off or something.
So for somebody that's like at home, maybe they want to start doing like regulating their movements themselves, like, or just doing some basic things with their watches, what would be some tools that you would maybe recommend? I think a screwdriver set makes sense, but you have a time grapher over there.
Yes.
I mean, is there anything else that should be kind of on a wish list? Like, what's like the basic kit that somebody needs for just like working on their watch for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say some good tweezers. Brass tweezers we use. Nickel or steel can scratch bridges, especially in really high-end watches. German silver, that kind of thing. We use even some wood tip tweezers to handle really delicate bridges.
Interesting.
Screwdrivers, of course, timing machines, a lot of timing machines out there, a lot of cheap ones. Personally, I haven't had a chance to really give any of the Chinese ones a try. I've heard some mixed things about them. So.
I have one, but I have nothing to really compare it to the pro stuff. So I mean,
exactly.
it does the job.
I'm
for
sure.
me.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. And for the money that you save, I think for the hobbyist, it's fine with that. But yeah, I mean, those are kind of your basic things, other than maybe sizing tools to change bands and size, that kind of thing.
All right, cool. So what else do we have in here? Like, what are some other things that you perhaps use on a day-to-day basis that somebody would have no idea that even happens?
Kind of in water testing again. I would say we do at least a dozen tests a day on this. This is a new machine that came out a couple years ago from Witchy. So it's all touchscreen. You can save, I believe, up to like 50 different programs. You can do up to 3 tests. So our standard dive test is a negative 0.7 bar, and then a 1 bar test, and then a 10 bar pressure test. These only go up to 10 bars, so anything over that, you're gonna have to do wet testing. So yes, this uses air, pressurizes it, or in a vacuum, and measures the deflection of the crystal and of the case back. And if it is out of tolerance, then it fails. So this is just kind of a quick test, theoretical test to see if it's gonna be water resistant or not. And kind of on that note, theoretical versus actual, back here, we have our wet testing machines. And if you think about dry testing, dry is air, wet is actually water, obviously. So the first test that we have is our diabolic E, and that measures in a vacuum. And we look to see, A, that it's sealed, but if it's got a leak in there somewhere, then we can actually see where that leak is coming from. Say, for example, the crystal gasket is leaking, it'll show a stream of air bubbles, and we'll be like, okay, this is failing here, we'll have to remedy that.
What depth can these like replicate? What are they usually replicating in terms of?
So this goes back to negative 0.8 bar.
Okay.
We test anywhere from generally negative 0.5 or 6 to negative 0.8, depending on if it's a ladies or if it's chronograph or whatever the application is. This goes up to 1,250 meters.
Okay.
So this is the big boy test.
Yeah, there you go. You got to pass that one to get the ETA.
Yeah, so Planet Oceans, we can test a lot of them if it's a true dive watch, professional dive watch, or if the customer asks if it's particularly a dive watch with rotating bezel, then we try to test it 25% over what the dial says. So if it's 600 meters, then you're testing it to 750 meters water resistance. And then it's in here, like I said, each brand's different. For example, the Planet Ocean, it's in here about an hour and a half, whether it's got no pressure, just kind of sitting, stabilizing, or under pressure. And then you move directly from here. Obviously, you're kind of checking along the way to see if there's any obvious signs of moisture. But after that test, you move to this test that has, and again, you can have a lot of different settings and kind of cater to whatever brand you have. So I have it set up for the Planet Ocean test. This will heat this plate up to 50 degrees Celsius, and then it'll cool it down and on the crystal and kind of do a shock test to 5 degrees Celsius to see if there's any condensation in there, any micro drops of water that have gotten in somehow that you can't see immediately, but will show up in this test. We got this ultrasonic cleaner. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. So this is for cleaning the movements. We've had this for quite some time, but it still works great.
So do you disassemble and then put all the parts in there? Like, is that what you would do?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all the movement parts that are disassembled, you can do pre-cleaning too. So typically you'll take the hands, dial, calendar, disc off, and then clean the watch as a whole movement, and then you completely disassemble it and then do your final clean and then assembly. I mean, you have to be careful too with a watchmaker. Some will just assemble, or some will keep it assembled, clean it, and then just oil where they can see it needs oil.
Yep.
And not fully disassemble. Obviously, that's dangerous to do when you're not really looking over the whole movement and seeing any worn parts. That's the main difference between antique watches and modern watches. All the materials in antique watches, you really don't see watches fail. You really don't see materials fail unless it's dropped, maybe. Back, 100 years ago with hardened steel and a lot of materials that they were using, watches would just break and stop, and then you'd be like, okay, I have to go and fix it. But now with modern components, if it runs dry for 20 years, it'll slowly kind of wear away. If the wheel hasn't been replaced over 20 years, it'll slowly wear away, and maybe it'll still function, but the pivots or pinions are super worn that it's just a catastrophe waiting to happen. So it's important to know your watchmaker, know they're competent, and know what they're actually doing, know they're not cutting corners, and make sure that they're doing it right and have the equipment to test it.
All right, so of course we're back here in polishing machine. So one thing that we were just discussing was like the different actually surface finishes that you can probably do with this machine. I think obviously polishing your watch all around makes a ton of sense, but like what other types of surface finish? Can you like do brush finishing with this? Like, how does that happen? Like, what do you do? What's the technique?
Yeah, so you can obviously do brushing. You can do straight brushing, and they also have circular. Like for example, your watch, the case back on your watch has a circular grain brushing on the outside. We can also do that too. There are different techniques we use.
Do you mind just if we got it rolling? Or you can
Absolutely.
That'd be kind of cool to see.
So we can. You want to be careful with any text, because you can distort it, you can drag it out, or you can just make it disappear altogether. Logos, you'll see a lot of Rolexes with the logos totally gone. So you want to stay off that as much as you can with this, because it is quite aggressive.
Have you ever got some skin against that ever?
It really doesn't hurt, honestly.
Oh, no, it doesn't?
It really doesn't. It's just kind of a weird feeling. But when you get this whipping around at, 2,500
I would think
RPM,
this feels like it would be kind of coarse on your skin.
This you would feel.
I feel like that's going to take some skin off.
That one you would feel.
Well, of course, I really appreciate all the time going through all this. And it's actually very interesting for myself. Definitely learned a few things.
Absolutely.
Well, guys, thank you again so much for watching. If you did find this video helpful, thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. It's a great help for the channel. Also, if you're in the Omaha area, definitely check out Borsheims. Great people in there. And TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of all the brands that we carry, and helps us create more content like this. Leave comments down below. Other videos you'd like us to see, go out and about. Really enjoy doing this stuff. But thank you guys again for watching. I'll see you all very soon.